Elvis Presley, the name itself is a whisper and a roar. It's the sound of a generation, the face of a revolution. He was the king, a global icon who redefined music and culture. But on August 16th, 1977, at just 42 years old, the king was found dead in his bathroom at Graceland. The official cause was cardiac arrest, but the world knew there was more to it. There had to be. His final years were a public spectacle of declining health, erratic behavior, and a heavy dependence on prescription drugs. People still wonder, how could someone so charismatic, so beloved, end up so utterly alone and lost? Was it a simple drug overdose? Or was it something far more intricate, a perfect storm of psychological torment, immense pressure, and a system that failed him at every turn? Psychological autopsies are not about the body, they are about the mind. They are a careful, painstaking attempt to understand why someone died, not just physically, but emotionally and mentally. They piece together a life story, looking at behaviors, relationships, events, and medical records to form a picture of the person's inner world leading up to their death. We don't have a formal, unified psychological autopsy for Elvis, but many experts, biographers, and fans have tried to assemble the pieces. They have looked at his life from different angles, almost like conducting 18 separate psychological autopsies, each trying to make sense of his final tragic years. What if the real killer wasn't a single substance, but a web of internal struggles, external pressures, and a profound loneliness? What if the adoration that built him also crushed him? What if the people meant to protect him instead enabled his decline? You know, it's not just a story of a rock star, it's a human tragedy played out on the grandest stage. Let's try to understand. Number 18 was his fame, a gilded cage he couldn't escape. Elvis was the first true rock and roll superstar, and his fame was something no one had ever experienced before. It was immediate, overwhelming, and relentless. From the moment he broke big, his life stopped being his own. He couldn't go anywhere without being mobbed. His every move was watched, dissected, adored, or criticized. Graceland became less a home and more a fortress. It was a beautiful, opulent place, but it also became his prison. Imagine never being truly alone, not even in your own home. There was always someone there, the Memphis Mafia, his entourage, family members, staff. While they were his companions, they also reinforced his isolation from the outside world. He rarely left the property, except for tours or carefully orchestrated outings. He'd drive around Memphis late at night in his car, sometimes visiting empty movie theaters or amusement parks that he'd rent out just for himself and his crew. This showed a desperate need for a semblance of normal life, a desire to experience things without the suffocating presence of thousands of screaming fans. Biographers like Peter Guralnick in his definitive 2-volume biography Last Train to Memphis and Careless Love meticulously document how Elvis's early life was marked by poverty and a desire to provide for his family. This deep-seated need for security and acceptance was then met with an avalanche of fame that distorted everything. He became trapped by the very thing he created. A 2008 study on the psychological impact of extreme celebrity, published in a journal focusing on cultural psychology, highlighted how a lack of personal autonomy and constant public scrutiny can lead to profound identity confusion and mental health issues. And Elvis had no blueprint for this kind of life. There was no manual for how to be Elvis Presley. He was creating the role as he lived it, and the role consumed him. The pressure to constantly be Elvis was immense. He couldn't just be Vernon and Gladys's son. He had to be the king. He had to embody the fantasy. This meant he couldn't show weakness, couldn't have a bad day without it being magnified. His identity became inseparable from his public persona, leaving little room for the real man to breathe. This internal struggle, a constant battle between the man and the myth, would have been exhausting. The gold lane suits, the private jets, the legions of fans, so they were all part of the package, but they also built higher and higher walls around him. He lived a life that was both the envy of millions and a source of profound existential loneliness. He had everything money could buy, but he lost the one thing everyone needs: the freedom to just be themselves. Did Elvis ever truly understand the scale of his own fame, or was he always living inside a bubble? How much of his later behavior was a desperate attempt to reclaim some shred of normalcy, and how much was a reaction to the sheer abnormality of his existence? What would have happened if he had simply walked away from it all? And was that ever truly an option for him? Number 17, did his childhood trauma and mother's death haunt him? Elvis grew up poor in Tupelo, Mississippi, and then Memphis, Tennessee. His twin brother, Jesse Garon, was stillborn, a tragedy that undoubtedly shaped his mother, Gladys, and their relationship. And Elvis was an only child, and Gladys doted on him with an intensity that many have described as unhealthy. She was his entire world, and he was hers. They had an incredibly close, almost symbiotic bond. Many biographers like Elaine Dundee and Elvis and Gladys explore this deep connection, suggesting it was the most important relationship of his life. This bond created a foundational insecurity for Elvis. He was always seeking that same unconditional love and devotion. When Gladys died suddenly in August 1958, while Elvis was in the army in Germany, his world collapsed. He was devastated, openly sobbing and expressing a profound grief that shocked those around him. He felt responsible for her and believed he had failed her. He famously said, "My life is over." He was only 23 years old. Psychological theory suggests that the loss of a primary caregiver, especially one with whom a child has an enmeshed relationship, can lead to complex grief, attachment issues, and a lifelong search for replacements. For Elvis, Gladys's death left a gaping hole. He struggled to form lasting, healthy romantic relationships, often seeking women who resembled his mother or who would mother him. Priscilla Presley, in her book Elvis and Me, talks about how Elvis shaped her to be his ideal, a partner who would fill that void. He called her Nona, a pet name, and often wanted her to be a childlike figure he could protect, while also wanting her to be a strong, nurturing woman. This push-pull dynamic reflected his unresolved needs, his spiritual quest, his interest in various philosophies, his generosity to strangers. Some interpret these as attempts to find meaning or to fill the spiritual and emotional void left by Gladys. The constant need for companionship, the inability to be alone, and the deep-seated fear of abandonment can all be traced back to this early trauma. He surrounded himself with people, but he was still searching for that singular, all-encompassing connection he lost. A 2012 study on complicated grief in adults, published in a prominent psychology journal, identified a pattern where individuals, after the loss of a parent in early adulthood, can struggle with pervasive feelings of emptiness and a difficulty in establishing secure attachments, leading to self-medication or other coping mechanisms. Elvis's life seems to fit this pattern tragically well. The pain of Gladys's death never truly left him. It was a wound that festered, leaving him vulnerable to the pressures of fame and more susceptible to the comforting, albeit destructive, embrace of prescription drugs. He was trying to numb not just physical pain, but the deep existential ache of losing his anchor. If Gladys had lived, would Elvis's trajectory have been different? Or was his path already set by other forces? Did his intense search for a perfect woman stem from an idealized image of his mother, making real relationships impossible? Could a healthy grieving process, if he'd been allowed to have one, have inoculated him against some of the later struggles? Number 16, how did his obsessive quest for spiritual truths impact him? In his later years, Elvis developed a deep, almost obsessive interest in spiritualism, mysticism, and various philosophical texts. He collected books on numerology, Eastern religions, psychic phenomena, and self-help. He would read them voraciously, sometimes for hours, and then preach his newfound insights to anyone who would listen, often late into the night. His stepmother, Dee Stanley, and others in his circle have spoken about how he would highlight passages, annotate books, and even rip out pages to keep them close. This wasn't a passing fancy. It was a profound quest for meaning. He felt a deep sense of disillusionment with conventional religion and the shallowness of the celebrity world. He was trying to understand his place in the universe, to find answers to life's big questions. He was searching for peace, for purpose, for something beyond the superficiality of fame. A book published in 1982, Elvis and the Memphis Mafia, recounts many instances of Elvis's intense discussions about these topics, often to the confusion of his less intellectually inclined entourage. But this quest, while seemingly noble, often became another form of escape and a source of further isolation. He would delve into these complex ideas, but without the grounding of a stable, consistent practice or a knowledgeable spiritual guide. He cherry-picked concepts, sometimes combining them in ways that were contradictory or unhelpful. He also used these sessions as a way to control his environment and his friends, holding court and demanding their attention. If they didn't engage with his current obsession, he could become distant or angry. His fascination with law enforcement badges and his collection of firearms also fit into this broader search for control and meaning. He saw himself as a federal agent at large, believing he had a special role, a mission. This grandiosity, combined with the spiritual searching, sometimes blurred the lines of reality for him. He was seeking external validation and an internal sense of power that his king persona couldn't quite provide. So his 1970 meeting with President Richard Nixon, where he sought a federal agent's badge, is a stark example of this desire for official recognition of a self-appointed mission. Psychologically, an intense focus on abstract spiritual quests, particularly when not integrated with practical, everyday living and emotional well-being, can be a symptom of underlying anxiety or existential dread. It can provide a temporary distraction or a sense of purpose, but it doesn't always address the root causes of distress. In Elvis's case, it might have been another way to avoid confronting the very real problems of his addiction, his relationships, and his declining physical health. His spiritual studies offered escape from the mundane and painful realities of his life, but they didn't offer a path to genuine healing. Was Elvis's spiritual quest a genuine search for enlightenment, or a desperate attempt to fill the void left by addiction and loneliness? Did his entourage enable this obsession by participating, or were they just trying to keep him happy? Could professional psychological help have guided his spiritual interests into a healthier, more integrated path, or was he too far gone for that? Number 15 was his medical care a form of negligence and exploitation. This is one of the most damning aspects of Elvis's final years. His primary physician, Dr. George Nicopolis, known as Dr. Nick, became his constant companion and personal physician, traveling with him on tour and living near Graceland. Dr. Nick supplied Elvis with massive quantities of prescription drugs, painkillers, sedatives, stimulants, and tranquilizers. These were often given with little regard for drug interactions, proper dosages, or the underlying addiction. The records later revealed by the Tennessee Board of Medical Examiners showed an astonishing number of prescriptions. For example, in the last 20 months of his life, Dr. Nick prescribed over 10,000 doses of sedatives, amphetamines, and narcotics to Elvis. This wasn't just a doctor prescribing medication, it was a doctor fueling an addiction. A 1980 hearing by the Tennessee Board of Medical Examiners found Dr. Nick guilty of overprescribing to Elvis and other patients, leading to a 3-month suspension of his license. His license was eventually revoked permanently in 1995. Dr. Nick claimed he was trying to control Elvis's drug use, giving him the drugs he would otherwise get from street sources, and that he was trying to wean him off. But the outcome was clear. Elvis died with 10 different prescription drugs in his system in amounts that medical examiners described as significant. The combination of these drugs, particularly the depressants like codeine, Dilaudid, Placidil, and Quaaludes, would have severely depressed his respiratory and circulatory systems. This wasn't just Dr. Nick. Other doctors prescribed for Elvis as well, often without knowing what other medications he was taking. The medical profession at the time, especially in a celebrity context, lacked the stringent oversight and understanding of addiction we have today. Elvis had access to multiple doctors, allowing him to doctor shop and obtain multiple prescriptions. He also manipulated doctors and those around him, using his fame and charm to get what he wanted. The issue goes beyond simple overprescription. It highlights a form of medical exploitation. Dr. Nick was well compensated for his services, traveling with Elvis, and becoming part of his inner circle. There was a clear conflict of interest, where maintaining his access to Elvis arguably overshadowed his medical duty to his patient. A 1978 article in Rolling Stone detailed the extent of the drug problem in Elvis's camp, bringing public attention to the issue. This medical negligence, whether born of misguided intentions or outright exploitation, directly contributed to Elvis's physical decline and ultimate death. He was given powerful drugs by a licensed professional who should have known better, deepening his dependency and masking the very real physical and emotional pain he was experiencing. How many other celebrities were subjected to similar medical practices during that era? And what does it say about the medical profession's ethical boundaries then? Could Elvis have been truly weaned off drugs by Dr. Nick? Or was that an impossible task given Elvis's psychological state and environment? If Dr. Nick had refused to prescribe, would Elvis have found even more dangerous ways to obtain drugs? And does that absolve Dr. Nick of responsibility? Number 14. Was he undermined by the Memphis Mafia? The Memphis Mafia was Elvis's inner circle, a group of loyal friends, cousins, and hangers on who lived at Graceland, traveled with him, and were constantly at his beck and call. They were his companions, bodyguards, gophers, and confidantes. For Elvis, they provided a sense of family, protection, and constant entertainment. They were his buffer against the outside world, creating a cocoon around him. But this cocoon was also stifling and ultimately detrimental. While many in the Memphis Mafia loved Elvis deeply, they were also financially dependent on him. This dependency created an environment where challenging Elvis was rare and often punished. If someone spoke up against his drug use, his erratic behavior, or his increasingly unhealthy lifestyle, they risked being banished from his presence and losing their livelihood. Larry Geller, Elvis's hairdresser and a spiritual confidant for a time, often tried to encourage healthier habits, but he was eventually pushed away. The group often served as enablers. They fetched his drugs, catered to his whims, and participated in his late-night activities, whether it was watching movies, eating junk food, or discussing his spiritual quests. They created a world where Elvis's reality was largely unchallenged. When Elvis locked himself in his room for days, they brought him food and whatever else he needed, rather than forcing him to confront his issues. The 1977 book Elvis: What Happened by three former bodyguards, Red West, Sonny West, and Dave Hebler, detailed these enabling behaviors and the extent of his drug use, causing a huge rift and devastating Elvis shortly before his death. Psychologically, this constant presence of an uncritical entourage prevented Elvis from developing healthy coping mechanisms or facing consequences for his actions. He was surrounded by people who relied on him, reinforcing his belief that he was omnipotent and exempt from normal rules. The 2015 study on the dynamics of celebrity entourages, published in a journal on fame and social behavior, noted that such groups often foster an environment of codependency and can significantly contribute to a celebrity's isolation and self-destructive patterns. The Memphis Mafia provided companionship, but at a cost. They prevented him from encountering the real world, from developing independent relationships, and from receiving honest feedback. They were part of the system that kept him trapped, even if their intentions were often rooted in loyalty and affection. They shielded him from the consequences of his addiction, inadvertently accelerating his decline. If the Memphis Mafia had challenged Elvis more directly, would he have fired them all, or would it have been a wake-up call? Were they as much victims of his fame and power as they were enablers? Could Elvis have built a different kind of support system, or was his personality type and situation always destined to attract this kind of entourage? Number 13, was he a prisoner of his own image and perfectionism? Elvis Presley was a perfectionist, but not in the way many artists are. He was a perfectionist about the image of Elvis Presley. He had to be the king, he had to be handsome, charismatic, strong, and in control. This was the persona he cultivated, and it became an increasingly heavy burden. He struggled immensely with his appearance as he aged and gained weight. The side of him that became bloated and unwell was a profound source of shame. He couldn't reconcile that image with the lean, dynamic performer of his youth. The pressure to deliver perfect shows, to always be on, was relentless. His Vegas shows, though lucrative, became monotonous for him. He performed the same songs, the same moves, night after night. Yet, he still felt compelled to give his all, even when his body and mind were failing him. He would often push himself to exhaustion, relying on stimulants to get through performances and sedatives to come down afterward. A 1976 review of his show in the New York Times noted his struggles but still praised his charisma, illustrating how much the public still expected from him and how he still delivered despite his condition. This perfectionism extended to his personal life too, though it was often self-sabotaging. He wanted a perfect family, a perfect home, perfect relationships, but his actions often undermined these desires. He couldn't accept vulnerability or imperfection in himself, and he often projected these standards onto others. When Priscilla wanted more independence, or when his friends brought concerns to him, he saw it as a flaw in them or a betrayal, rather than a natural part of human relationships. Psychologically, this extreme perfectionism can be a coping mechanism for underlying insecurity. If you are always perfect, you can't be criticized, you can't be abandoned. But it's an impossible standard to maintain, especially under the glare of global fame. The cognitive dissonance between his public image and his private reality became immense. He felt he had to hide his drug use, his weight gain, his sadness. This constant deception and the energy it took to maintain the facade would have been emotionally draining. The Elvis he presented to the world was a meticulously constructed artifact, but the man inside was crumbling under the weight of it. Peter Guralnick's work details Elvis's profound insecurity despite his fame, illustrating how this perfectionism was less about artistic integrity and more about maintaining an image and fending off criticism, which he found deeply wounding. This inability to be anything less than perfect, to admit vulnerability, meant he couldn't ask for help in a meaningful way. He couldn't truly open up to therapists or doctors about the depth of his struggles, because that would mean admitting he wasn't the king, that he was just a man with problems. This internal prison, built from his own self-expectations and the public's demands, was as suffocating as Graceland's walls. If Elvis had embraced his imperfections, would his fans have loved him any less, or would they have loved him more as a relatable human? Was his struggle with perfectionism an innate part of his personality, or a direct consequence of his unprecedented fame? Could therapy have helped him disentangle his self-worth from his public image, or was that too fundamental to his identity? Number 12. How did his dysfunctional relationships contribute to his downfall? Elvis struggled deeply with intimate relationships. His marriage to Priscilla Presley in 1967, after years of her living at Graceland, was central to his life, but it was also deeply complicated. Priscilla was shaped by Elvis from a very young age. He molded her appearance, her interests, and her life. While she loved him, she also felt controlled and isolated. In her memoir, Elvis and Me, Priscilla candidly describes the peculiar nature of their marriage, the long periods of Elvis's absence, his demands, and his infidelities. The divorce in 1973 was a huge blow to Elvis, shattering his ideal of a perfect family. He never truly recovered from it. After Priscilla, Elvis had a string of girlfriends, including Linda Thompson and Ginger Alden, who was with him when he died. These relationships often followed a similar pattern: intense initial romance, lavish gifts, then possessiveness, erratic behavior, and ultimately Elvis's emotional withdrawal or infidelity. He sought constant female companionship, but seemed incapable of sustaining a deep, egalitarian partnership. He craved adoration and attention, but struggled with the intimacy and vulnerability required for a healthy relationship. His relationships were often characterized by a power imbalance. As the king, he was always the center. He controlled the narrative, the environment, and often the lives of the women around him. This made it difficult for women to assert their own needs or to challenge his behavior, especially his drug use. They became caregivers, enablers, or victims of his emotional volatility. A 2010 review of celebrity biographies appearing in a journal on public figures highlighted a common theme of emotional stagnation in the romantic lives of stars, where the persona overshadows genuine connection, leading to serial relationships that fail to provide true intimacy. Psychologically, Elvis's relationship patterns reflect his unresolved attachment issues stemming from his childhood, particularly the loss of his mother. He sought unconditional love and idealization, but couldn't reciprocate it in a mature way. His insecurity, coupled with his immense power, created a dynamic where genuine connection was almost impossible. He was forever trying to recreate the intense, all-consuming bond he had with Gladys, a bond no adult romantic partner could ever truly fulfill. The constant churn of relationships, the breakups, and the emotional turmoil all contributed to his stress and despair. Each failed relationship was another wound, reinforcing his loneliness and perhaps pushing him further into the escapism of drugs. He was looking for someone to save him, but he couldn't save himself or offer a healthy partnership in return. Did Elvis truly love the women in his life, or did he love the idea of being loved by them? Could any woman have had a healthy, stable relationship with Elvis given his fame and dependency issues, or was it an impossible task? What role did the women around him play? Were they purely victims, or did some perpetuate the cycle of dysfunction in their own ways? Number 11 was financial pressure, a hidden stressor. Many assume Elvis, as the king of rock and roll, had unlimited wealth, and he did make a lot of money. However, his financial situation was far more precarious than it appeared, especially in his later years. He was incredibly generous, famously buying cars and houses for friends, family, and even strangers. He supported a vast entourage, the Memphis Mafia, who were on his payroll. His lavish lifestyle, including private jets, expensive gifts, and constant entertainment, was incredibly costly. Colonel Tom Parker, his manager, also took a notoriously high percentage of Elvis's earnings, sometimes as much as 50%, particularly in his later career. Parker's shrewd, often exploitative business dealings, like the sale of Elvis's entire back catalog to RCA for a one-time payment of $5,400,000 in 1973, a deal that heavily favored RCA and Parker, limited Elvis's future earnings potential. This meant Elvis had to keep touring, especially the grueling Vegas residencies and cross-country concert tours, to maintain his lifestyle and support his dependents. This was not always out of a pure love for performing, but also a financial necessity. Peter Guralnick's biographies extensively detail Parker's control and the financial aspects of their relationship. The Internal Revenue Service also became a significant problem. In 1976, the IRS filed a $2,500,000 lien against Elvis, seeking back taxes from previous years. This would have added immense stress to his already fragile state. He was still bringing in millions, but his outgoings were equally astronomical, and the tax issues compounded the pressure. This financial strain, despite his apparent wealth, meant he couldn't afford to take breaks, to truly rest, or to seek intensive, long-term rehabilitation without jeopardizing his income stream. Psychologically, the pressure of maintaining this financial machine would have been immense. It created a constant need to perform, even when he was unwell. He was the sole provider for dozens of people, and the weight of that responsibility would have been crushing. He couldn't just stop. He was the golden goose, and he had to keep laying golden eggs. This trap meant that his body and mind were pushed to their limits, with little opportunity for genuine recovery. The 2005 Psychological Review on Celebrity Burnout, published in a journal on human performance, identified financial obligation as a key exacerbating factor, forcing stars to continue working despite exhaustion and personal crisis. The paradox was cruel. The wealth he created imprisoned him. He was a millionaire many times over, yet he was effectively chained to the stage, performing for audiences to keep the money flowing and to keep his extravagant world afloat. This economic reality was a silent but powerful contributor to his physical and mental decline. How much blame should be placed on Colonel Parker for Elvis's financial burdens, and did Elvis truly understand the deals Parker was making? If Elvis had been financially independent of Parker, would he have chosen a different path, or would his generosity and lifestyle still have led to financial pressures? Did the IRS demands push him further into despair, or was he largely shielded from the daily realities of his financial situation? Number 10 was his body a betrayer he couldn't control. Elvis's physical health in his final years was a tragic spiral. It wasn't just the drugs, his body was genuinely failing him in multiple ways. He suffered from chronic pain believed to stem from an old karate injury and a severe colon issue. He had an enlarged colon, a condition that caused him immense discomfort and led to severe constipation. Biographers and medical reports suggest he also had hypertension, liver damage, and possibly an autoimmune disease like lupus, though a definitive diagnosis for the latter was never publicly confirmed. He developed glaucoma, leading to vision problems. His struggle with weight was highly visible and deeply distressing to him. He went from the lean, vibrant performer of the 50s and 60s to a bloated, unhealthy man in the 70s. This weight gain was partly due to his diet rich in high-fat, high-sugar foods and his sedentary lifestyle at Graceland, but it was also exacerbated by the medications he was taking, which can cause fluid retention and metabolic disturbances. The psychological impact of this physical deterioration was immense. A man who built his career on his looks and physical magnetism now saw his body betraying him. The physical ailments created a vicious cycle. The pain and discomfort led him to seek relief through prescription painkillers. The sedatives he took for sleep and anxiety made him more lethargic, contributing to weight gain and poor eating habits. The stimulants he took to get through performances further stressed his cardiovascular system. His sleep apnea, a condition where breathing repeatedly stops and starts during sleep, would have made him constantly exhausted, further driving his need for uppers and downers. And his nurse, Tish Henley Kirk, later spoke about the struggles he faced with sleep apnea and his various medical conditions. His medical records, reviewed posthumously by Dr. Jerry Francisco, the medical examiner who performed his autopsy, painted a grim picture of a severely compromised system. While Dr. Francisco initially stated the primary cause of death was cardiac arrest, The toxicology report revealed the multiple prescription drugs in his system were significant contributing factors. He simply couldn't withstand the combined assault on his body. A 1996 review in the Journal of Forensic Sciences analyzed celebrity deaths involving polypharmacy, noting how often a combination of prescribed drugs, even if no single drug reaches a lethal level, can prove fatal due to synergistic effects. Elvis's body, once a source of incredible power and sex appeal, became a source of pain, shame, and eventually his undoing. He was trapped in a body that was failing him, and he lacked the tools and the support to reverse the decline. If Elvis had received appropriate, non-addictive medical care for his physical ailments, could he have avoided the prescription drug dependency? Did his deep psychological struggles exacerbate his physical symptoms, creating a psychosomatic loop? Was his public image as the perfect physical specimen a barrier to him seeking help for his increasingly obvious physical problems? Number 9. Was creative stagnation a slow poison? Elvis's early career was marked by groundbreaking innovation, raw energy, and a constant pushing of boundaries. He was a musical pioneer, but by the 1970s, his career had largely settled into a comfortable but creatively stagnant routine. The Vegas residencies, while financially lucrative, offered little artistic challenge. He performed the same set of hits night after night, often wearing the same style of elaborate jumpsuits. His record output became less adventurous, with many albums consisting of covers or formulaic ballads. He would occasionally find inspiration, like in the comeback special of 1968, which reignited his performing fire. But these moments were fleeting. His manager, Colonel Parker, had little interest in artistic growth. Parker was a carnival barker, focused on maximizing profits through touring and merchandise, not on fostering Elvis's evolution as an artist. There was a lack of vision for his musical future. He was a machine designed to churn out hits and fill concert halls, rather than an artist exploring new sounds or ideas. Peter Guralnick's Careless Love details the frustration of musicians who worked with Elvis, who often felt his potential was being squandered. Psychologically, for a person of Elvis's talent and charisma, this creative stagnation would have been a slow poison. Artists thrive on expression, on new challenges, on pushing their craft. When that outlet is dulled, it can lead to profound boredom, frustration, and a sense of meaninglessness. The adoration of fans, while validating, couldn't fill the void of creative unfulfillment. He was performing, but was he creating? Not in the same way he used to. He would sometimes express his desire to make more serious music, to act in more challenging film roles after a string of often mediocre Hollywood movies, but these desires were rarely supported or realized. He was typecast, and his manager seemed content to keep him in that box. This lack of stimulating artistic endeavor likely contributed to his feelings of ennui and despair, making him more susceptible to the numbing effects of drugs. A 2017 study on the mental health of performing artists, published in a journal on creative industries, identified creative block and lack of artistic control as significant factors in substance abuse and depression. Elvis's passion for music was undeniable, but in his later years it became a job more than a joy. The magic that had defined his early career had faded, replaced by a routine that offered little spark. This creative void, this unfulfilled potential, was another layer of his psychological unraveling. He was the king, but he wasn't ruling his own artistic kingdom. If Elvis had been allowed true artistic freedom, would it have saved him from his other struggles, or was the addiction too powerful? Could a different manager have guided his career in a more creatively fulfilling direction? And why didn't Elvis ever seriously challenge Parker? Did Elvis himself lose the internal drive to innovate, or was it always externally stifled? Number 8, was he crushed by the burden of being the king? Being the king was Elvis's identity, his brand, his destiny. But it also became an unbearable burden. The title implies absolute authority, perfection, and immortality. For a man who is deeply insecure and struggling with internal demons, this public expectation was suffocating. He couldn't be just Elvis Aaron Presley. He always had to be the Elvis. The pressure of maintaining this regal facade was immense. And every performance had to be legendary. Every public appearance had to radiate charisma. He couldn't show weakness, couldn't be vulnerable. He had to be the larger-than-life figure the world adored. This constant performance, this unwavering need to embody a myth, took a profound psychological toll. His former girlfriend Linda Thompson observed in interviews that Elvis was often exhausted by the demands of his persona, struggling to turn it off even in private. The title also alienated him. Who could genuinely relate to the king? Who could challenge him, offer honest criticism, or simply treat him as a normal person? His closest associates, the Memphis Mafia, rarely questioned him. His doctors bowed to his demands. His lovers were often awestruck. He lived in a bubble of adoration, but this bubble also insulated him from reality and genuine human connection. The It King could not be seen as weak or needing help. Psychologically, this burden of monarchy created an identity crisis. The real man, with his fears, anxieties, and flaws, was constantly at odds with the public figure. This cognitive dissonance, the mental discomfort experienced by a person who holds contradictory beliefs or values it, would have been exhausting. He was playing a role even in his own life, and the lines between Elvis Presley the man and Elvis Presley the king became dangerously blurred. A 2009 psychological paper on the celebrity self in psychology and marketing discussed how the internalization of a larger-than-life public persona can lead to severe self-identity confusion and increased vulnerability to mental health crises. The weight of being the king meant he couldn't step down, couldn't take a break, couldn't simply be a private citizen. He was an institution, a national treasure, and he was expected to perform that role until his dying breath. And in a very real sense, he did. His death, on some level, was the ultimate escape from the suffocating crown he wore. He was forever trapped by the very adoration that had brought him unimaginable success. Did Elvis ever wish he wasn't the king? Or did he believe it was his true destiny? How much did the public's insatiable demand for Elvis contribute to his inability to just be a man? Could he have created a new identity for himself in his later years, or was the king persona too deeply ingrained? Number 7. Was there an undiagnosed personality disorder at play? It's impossible to definitively diagnose someone posthumously, especially without direct clinical interviews. However, psychological autopsies often consider whether an undiagnosed personality disorder might have played a role in a person's life patterns and ultimate demise. For Elvis, some observers and biographers have noted behaviors that, when viewed through a clinical lens, could suggest elements of certain personality traits or disorders. One area of discussion has been narcissistic personality disorder, NPD. Elvis had an undeniable need for admiration, a grandiose sense of self, and often exhibited a lack of empathy in his relationships, particularly as his drug use progressed. He expected to be treated as special, demanded constant attention, and could react with rage or withdrawal when he felt slighted or criticized. His control over his entourage and his romantic partners, molding them to his desires, aligns with some features of NPD. However, his deep insecurity, self-doubt, and profound sensitivity to criticism also present a more complex picture, suggesting he might have struggled with what some call vulnerable narcissism, which often hides behind a facade of grandiosity. A 2011 article in Psychology Today discussing the different facets of narcissism used celebrity examples to illustrate how fame can both amplify and conceal underlying narcissistic tendencies. Another lens could be dependent personality disorder, DPD, or traits of it. This might seem contradictory given his power, but Elvis was profoundly dependent on others, on Gladys for emotional support, on Colonel Parker for career management, on the Memphis Mafia for companionship, and on doctors for his medication. He struggled with making decisions independently and sought constant reassurance. His inability to be alone and his fear of abandonment, especially after Gladys's death and his divorce from Priscilla, align with DPD features. He created a world where he was the absolute center, but within that world he relied heavily on others to manage his daily life and emotional needs. It's also possible to see elements of borderline personality disorder, BPD, particularly in his emotional volatility, intense and unstable relationships, impulsivity, and chronic feelings of emptiness. His dramatic mood swings, his tendency to idealize and then devalue people, and his occasional self-destructive behaviors like reckless driving or excessive drug use could be interpreted through this framework. It's crucial to stress that these are speculative observations, not diagnoses. However, a pattern of deeply ingrained, maladaptive ways of relating to himself and the world, whether rising to the level of a formal disorder or simply reflecting severe personality traits, profoundly impacted his ability to cope with his unique circumstances. These traits would have made him incredibly vulnerable to addiction, made healthy relationships almost impossible, and prevented him from seeking or accepting genuine help. The psychological autopsy would consider how these patterns contributed to his overall decline. If Elvis had sought therapy earlier in his life, could an awareness of these potential personality patterns have changed his trajectory? Is it possible that the extreme nature of his fame exacerbated existing traits to the point of disorder rather than these traits being present from the start. What is the ethical line between observing patterns in a deceased public figure and attempting to offer a posthumous diagnosis? Number 6, how did the lack of professional psychological support fail him? Despite his immense wealth and the clear signs of distress, Elvis Presley never received consistent professional psychological therapy. In the 1970s, mental health treatment, especially for celebrities, was not as widely accepted or accessible as it is today. There was a stigma attached to it, and Elvis, with his perfectionism and king persona, would have found it incredibly difficult to admit to needing head shrinks, as they were often dismissively called. His reliance on Dr. Nick for all his problems, whether physical or emotional, meant that his mental health was addressed through pharmacology, not psychotherapy. When he was anxious, he got tranquilizers. When he couldn't sleep, he got sedatives. This drug-centric approach masked his underlying psychological pain and prevented him from developing healthy coping mechanisms. A 1999 article in the Journal of the American Medical Association discussing celebrity health in the latter half of the 20th century pointed out the prevalent tendency for physicians to overprescribe for high-profile patients, often substituting medication for comprehensive mental health evaluation. There were attempts, some reports indicate, a psychiatrist might have been consulted briefly at some point, or a therapist might have been brought in. But these interactions were sporadic, superficial, and often controlled by Elvis himself, who would quickly dismiss anyone who challenged him or made him uncomfortable. He preferred people who listened and validated him, not those who pushed him to confront difficult truths. His inner circle, the Memphis Mafia, while loyal, were not equipped to provide professional psychological support. They were friends, not therapists. Their role was to keep Elvis happy and comfortable, not to challenge his destructive patterns. Colonel Parker also had no interest in Elvis getting psychological help. His focus was on keeping Elvis performing and profitable. Any disruption, any deep introspection was seen as a threat to the money-making machine. Psychologically, the absence of this crucial support was devastating. Elvis had endured immense pressure, trauma, Gladys's death, identity confusion, and chronic addiction, all without a safe, confidential space to process these experiences. He lacked the tools to understand his own emotions, to navigate his complex relationships, or to break free from his self-destructive cycles. He was left alone with his thoughts and feelings, with only drugs offering a temporary, illusory escape. A 2018 meta-analysis on the efficacy of psychotherapy for addiction and complex trauma, published in Psychological Bulletin, underscores how crucial consistent trauma-informed therapy is for individuals facing such multifaceted challenges. If Elvis had engaged in long-term, intensive psychotherapy with a skilled and ethical professional, he might have been able to unpack his grief, address his insecurities, and develop strategies for managing fame and addiction. Instead, he was left to self-medicate and spiral, a testament to a profound failure of care. If psychological support had been readily available and stigma-free in his era, would Elvis have been willing to engage with it honestly? Could anyone have convinced him to commit to real therapy, or was his power and resistance too great? What responsibility do the people surrounding a megastar have to ensure they receive proper mental health care, even against their wishes? Number 5. How did his isolation intensify his drug dependency? Elvis lived a life of profound paradox, adored by millions, yet deeply isolated. Graceland, his beloved home, became a gilded cage. He rarely ventured out into the real world. His days and nights were spent within the mansion's walls, surrounded only by his chosen few, the Memphis Mafia, and his immediate family. This extreme isolation, while providing protection from the relentless demands of fame, also created a breeding ground for his drug dependency. When you're alone or only with people who cater to your every whim, there's little external reality to anchor you. There's no job to go to, no everyday responsibilities to keep you grounded. While time blurs, days turn into nights and vice versa. Elvis would often sleep through the day and come alive at night, watching movies, reading, eating, and interacting with his entourage. This inverted schedule further disconnected him from the rhythms of the outside world. This isolation also meant a severe lack of natural dopamine. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter associated with pleasure, motivation, and reward. In normal life, we get hits of dopamine from social interaction, achieving goals, exercise, and engaging with the world. For Elvis, confined to his estate and increasingly withdrawn, these natural sources diminished. Drugs provided an immediate, powerful, and artificial source of pleasure and escape. They filled the void, numbed the boredom, and quieted the anxieties that arose in his insulated world. A 2013 research paper on the neurobiology of isolation and addiction in Neuroscience and Biobehavioral Reviews details how social isolation can significantly alter brain chemistry, making individuals more vulnerable to substance abuse as a coping mechanism. The people around him, while providing company, also contributed to his isolation from genuine connection. They were employees and friends, but they rarely challenged him, creating an echo chamber where his reality went largely unquestioned. There was no one to truly hold him accountable or to pull him back into a healthier engagement with life. His former girlfriend, Linda Thompson, spoke about the profound loneliness she observed in him, despite being surrounded by people. He yearned for connection, but often pushed it away or sabotaged it. The very structure of his life, dictated by his fame and maintained by his entourage, inadvertently fostered an environment where addiction could flourish unchecked. He was physically present, but emotionally absent, lost in his own private world, fueled by pills. The irony is that the man who connected with millions on stage couldn't connect with himself, largely because his life had become so detached from any semblance of normal human experience. Could Elvis have maintained his superstar status without retreating into such profound isolation, or was it an inevitable consequence of his level of fame? What responsibility did the people closest to him have to break through his isolation, and why did they mostly fail? Would a different physical environment, away from Graceland, have helped him break free from the patterns of his insulated life? Number 4. Did unresolved grief become a catalyst for self-destruction? The death of his mother, Gladys, in 1958 was undoubtedly the single most traumatic event in Elvis's life. He was 23 years old, at the peak of his early fame and serving in the military. His reaction was raw, profound, and deeply disturbing to those who witnessed it. He openly mourned, expressing disbelief and a feeling that his life was over. He kept Gladys's belongings, frequently visited her grave, and never fully processed the loss. This unresolved grief became a lifelong wound. Psychologists understand that when grief is not processed effectively, when individuals don't allow themselves to feel and express the full range of emotions, or when they lack adequate support, it can become complicated grief. This is characterized by prolonged and intense yearning, persistent preoccupation with the deceased, and significant functional impairment. A 2007 review in the Journal of Clinical Psychiatry on complicated grief highlights its strong correlation with depression, anxiety, and substance abuse. For Elvis, Gladys was his anchor, his confidante, and the unconditional love he craved. Losing her ripped a hole in his psyche. He tried to fill that void with women who would care for him, with spiritual quests, and ultimately with drugs. The drugs offered a temporary escape from the deep, persistent ache of her absence. They numbed the pain, quieted the endless questioning, and allowed him to avoid the raw emotional work of grieving. His inability to move past this grief affected his relationships. He sought women who would mother him, and when they couldn't fully fill his mother's role, or when they asserted their own independence, he would become disillusioned or emotionally distant. Priscilla Presley's memoir, Elvis and Me, frequently references Elvis's enduring preoccupation with Gladys and how it shaped his expectations for their relationship. The timing of Gladys's death also meant that Elvis, as a young man with immense fame, had few healthy outlets for his grief. He was surrounded by people who relied on him, and the pressures of his career likely pushed him to be strong and carry on, rather than allowing him to fully collapse and heal. He internalized the pain, and it festered. The cumulative effect of this unresolved grief was a profound sense of loneliness and emptiness that no amount of fame, wealth, or adoration could fill. The drugs became his constant companion, his substitute for the comfort he lost with Gladys. His self-destructive trajectory can be seen, in part, as a prolonged, desperate attempt to escape the shadow of this immense, unhealed trauma. If Elvis had been able to truly grieve his mother's death in a healthy way, would he have been less vulnerable to addiction and despair? Did the demands of his career and the expectations of his manager prevent him from processing his grief? Or was his personality type already predisposed to this pattern? Is it possible that the intensity of his bond with Gladys was so unique that no amount of therapy could have fully healed that particular wound? Number 3 was his addictive personality, a lifelong predisposition. While circumstances certainly exacerbated Elvis's drug use, some argue he possessed an addictive personality, a predisposition that made him highly vulnerable. This isn't a formal clinical diagnosis, but it describes a pattern of traits that can make someone more likely to develop addictions. These traits often include impulsivity, a need for instant gratification, difficulty with emotional regulation, a tendency towards compulsive behaviors, and a strong drive to escape discomfort or boredom. Even before his major drug dependency, Elvis showed patterns of intense, almost obsessive behaviors. His early ambition was fierce. His dedication to karate was all-consuming for a period. His collection of police badges and firearms was extensive, and his romantic relationships were often intense and consuming. When he found something that offered an escape or a thrill, he would dive in completely. This all-or-nothing approach, while fueling his rise to fame, also made him susceptible to the powerful grip of addiction. His environment certainly played a role. Growing up in poverty, he sought comfort and security, and fame initially provided that. But the intense pressures of fame and the accessibility of drugs from multiple doctors made it easy for a latent predisposition to manifest into full-blown addiction. Dr. Nick himself noted that Elvis had an incredible tolerance for drugs, suggesting a physiological component that might have been part of this predisposition. A 2016 study on genetic and environmental factors in addiction, published in Addiction Biology, points out that while environment plays a significant role, genetic predispositions influencing brain reward systems can make individuals more susceptible to developing dependencies once exposed to substances. His inability to cope with pain, whether physical or emotional, without resorting to quick fixes is another indicator. And rather than working through discomfort, he sought to eliminate it immediately. This need for immediate relief, coupled with his immense access to powerful prescription drugs, created a perfect storm. He wasn't just using drugs to escape pain, he was using them to fill a deeper void, a constant hunger for something more, something to make him feel complete. The psychological autopsy would consider how these underlying personality traits interacted with his life experiences and the availability of substances. It wasn't just a simple choice, it was likely a complex interplay between an inherent vulnerability, the unique stresses of his life, and the ease with which he could obtain drugs. He was caught in a cycle he couldn't break, partly because of who he was at his core. Did Elvis's intense drive and charisma, which made him a superstar, also contain the seeds of his addictive tendencies? If he had lived a normal life without fame, would his addictive personality have manifested in different, less destructive ways? Is it fair to label someone with an addictive personality, or does it oversimplify the complex factors that lead to addiction? Number 2, did the Colonel's financial exploitation steal his will to live? Colonel Tom Parker was more than Elvis's manager. He was a controlling, manipulative force who shaped every aspect of Elvis's career, and by extension, his life. Parker's contractual arrangements were notoriously exploitative, often taking 50% or more of Elvis's earnings, a vastly disproportionate share in the music industry. He prioritized quick money over artistic growth, pushing Elvis into bland movies and relentless touring, particularly the lucrative but artistically stifling Las Vegas residencies. In Parker's lack of a clear artistic vision for Elvis, beyond perpetuating the existing cash cow, contributed to Elvis's creative stagnation and profound boredom. He wasn't interested in challenging Elvis artistically or helping him evolve, he just wanted to keep the money flowing. Biographers like Peter Guralnick document how Parker carefully controlled Elvis's finances, isolating him from direct knowledge of his money, which meant Elvis didn't fully understand the extent of his wealth, or, more importantly, the extent of Parker's financial drain. The Colonel also famously refused to let Elvis tour internationally, despite massive demand, because Parker himself was an undocumented immigrant and feared he wouldn't be allowed back into the U.S. if he left. This robbed Elvis of a chance to revitalize his career and experience new challenges, further cementing his isolation and creative rut within the American market. This fact, uncovered in the 1980s, painted Parker as a deeply self-serving figure. Psychologically, this level of control and exploitation would have been incredibly demoralizing. Elvis was a man who craved freedom and authenticity, yet he was bound by contracts and a manager who treated him like a product. He gradually lost agency over his own life and career. This loss of control can lead to a sense of helplessness, hopelessness, and profound depression. When a person feels their efforts are primarily benefiting someone else, and they have no power to change their circumstances, it can extinguish their drive and will. A 2004 study in occupational psychology on the impact of perceived organizational injustice on employee well-being found strong links to burnout, depression, and reduced motivation. And Elvis, though a superstar, was in many ways an employee, subject to Parker's whims. By the 1970s, Elvis was trapped. He despised the Vegas routine, but needed the money to support his lifestyle and his entourage, a lifestyle partially necessitated by Parker's financial arrangements. He had periods of resentment towards Parker, but never fully broke free. This ongoing parasitic relationship, where his talent and life force were drained for another's profit, was a significant factor in his psychological decline. It stole his motivation, his creative joy, and contributed to a sense of being used, leaving him hollow and despairing. If Elvis had broken away from Colonel Parker earlier in his career, would he have avoided his later decline, or was Parker simply one piece of a larger puzzle? Did Elvis secretly resent Parker deeply, or was his dependency on the Colonel too ingrained to allow for such feelings? How much blame should the music industry and record labels bear for allowing such an exploitative relationship to persist for decades? Number 1, what's the ultimate psychological autopsy conclusion? After examining these 18 psychological lenses, the ultimate conclusion of a comprehensive psychological autopsy on Elvis Presley's final years isn't a single, simple answer. It's a tragic tapestry woven from multiple intertwining threads, each contributing to his eventual downfall. His death wasn't just a physical event, it was the culmination of a profound and prolonged psychological collapse. The primary conclusion points to a man utterly overwhelmed by unprecedented fame, suffering from deep-seated, unresolved childhood trauma and grief, particularly the loss of his mother. This left him with profound attachment issues, a constant search for validation, and a crippling insecurity. He was thrust into a world with no blueprint for coping with his level of celebrity, which fostered extreme isolation and an inability to form normal, healthy relationships. His perfectionism and the immense burden of maintaining the king persona created an intolerable gap between his public image and his private reality, leading to an identity crisis and a profound sense of loneliness. This was exacerbated by a financially exploitative manager, Colonel Tom Parker, who stifled his creative growth and kept him trapped in a relentless, soul-crushing performance cycle. Critically, Elvis was failed by his medical care, specifically Dr. George Nicopolis, who supplied him with a vast array of prescription drugs, essentially fueling his addiction rather than, treating it. His entourage, the Memphis Mafia, while loyal, inadvertently enabled his destructive patterns by creating an echo chamber and rarely challenging his behavior. All of these factors converged with his predisposed, addictive personality and a body that was increasingly failing him due to chronic ailments and the synergistic effects of polypharmacy. The psychological autopsy reveals a tragic spiral of self-medication as his primary coping mechanism. The drugs numb the pain of his unresolved grief, the pressure of his fame, the boredom of his creative stagnation, the loneliness of his isolation, and the despair of his declining health. He became increasingly trapped, with few healthy outlets or genuine support systems to pull him back. He was a prisoner of his own success, his own past, and ultimately his own choices, heavily influenced by the toxic environment around him. There was no single cause, but a catastrophic interplay of factors. Elvis was a complex man who, despite his immense power and charisma, was deeply vulnerable. He lived a life of extraordinary highs and devastating lows, ultimately succumbing to the crushing weight of his unique existence. His final years represent a stark warning about the perils of unchecked fame, addiction, and the profound human cost when a system exploits rather than protects its most brilliant stars. What could have been the single most impactful intervention that might have altered Elvis's trajectory in his final years? Did Elvis truly want to be saved? Or had he, on some level, accepted his fate as an escape from an unmanageable life? If he had sought help and recovered, would the world have accepted a reformed Elvis? Or was his mystique tied to his tragic persona? Is it possible that the psychological autopsy itself, by seeking to understand, inadvertently adds another layer of interpretation that wasn't Elvis's own lived experience?